Richard Langford was one of those men you'd read about in glossy magazines.
He was a self-made millionaire, the owner of a booming real estate empire, and the face of success in his city.
His mansion sat on a hill overlooking the skyline, with glass walls that caught the morning sun and gardens manicured to perfection. He had a fleet of cars, a wardrobe worth more than most people's homes, and a calendar filled with business meetings, charity galas, and exclusive events. But despite all his accomplishments, there was one thing that money had never been able to fix.
His daughter, Emily.
Emily was 8 years old, with the face of an angel and eyes that seemed to hold entire worlds. But she had never taken a single step in her life. Born with a rare neuromuscular condition, her legs simply didn't have the strength to support her. Specialists from around the world had been consulted, the best surgeons, physical therapists, and neurologists money could hire. Richard had flown her to Switzerland, to Japan, to the United States, always chasing the next treatment, the next hope. Each time, he returned home with the same heavy heart.
Nothing worked.
Her wheelchair had become an extension of her body. And yet, Emily never complained. She smiled often, painted with watercolors, and loved listening to stories. But deep down, Richard knew her smile was a fragile shield. She longed for something she could never have: the freedom to run, to skip, to simply walk to the garden without help. Richard's wife, Claire, had passed away when Emily was just 3 years old, leaving him to juggle fatherhood and a demanding empire. He did his best, but business consumed him. So when it came to Emily's day-to-day care, he relied heavily on nannies. There had been many over the years, all professional, all well-paid. But none stayed for long. They either left for better offers or admitted they couldn't handle the emotional weight of caring for a child with such needs. Then came Sarah. She wasn't what Richard expected when his assistant scheduled the interview. She was in her late 20s, with a warm but unassuming presence. Her clothes were simple, her resume modest compared to the others. But there was something in her eyes, a calm determination, as if she could see through all the glitter of wealth and straight into the heart of the matter. During the interview, she didn't ask about the salary first. Instead, she asked about Emily. What did she like? What made her laugh? What scared her? It caught Richard off guard. Most candidates asked about schedules, benefits, or accommodations. Sarah seemed to care about one thing: the little girl she might be looking after. Emily took to her immediately. By the end of the first week, Richard noticed his daughter laughing more. Sarah had a way of making everyday moments magical. Turning lunchtime into little tea parties, turning trips to the garden into grand adventures. Richard was grateful, but he also kept his distance. He didn't like to get his hopes up. He'd learned that miracles didn't happen just because you wanted them to. Months passed. Richard was often away at meetings, but whenever he was home, he'd hear snippets of Sarah's gentle voice, or Emily's delighted giggles drifting down the hall. Something was changing, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Emily seemed stronger somehow. Her arms moved more confidently when she painted, her posture in the wheelchair looked different. One evening, Richard came home earlier than expected. He decided to surprise Emily by joining her for dinner. As he stepped into the hall, he heard music, soft piano notes coming from the living room. He approached quietly, not wanting to interrupt whatever moment was unfolding. And then he saw it. Sarah was on the floor with Emily, not in the wheelchair, but on a soft mat. Emily's legs were supported by a strange homemade contraption, bands of cloth, tiny cushions, and what looked like the handles from an old walker. Sarah was holding Emily upright, swaying gently to the music. They were dancing. Emily's feet were touching the floor. They weren't carrying her weight completely, but they were moving tiny, hesitant steps in rhythm with the melody. Her face was glowing, her laughter bubbling up like sunlight breaking through clouds. Richard froze, unable to breathe. He wanted to rush in, to ask what was happening, but something stopped him. He realized this was their moment, a fragile bubble that might burst if he interfered. So he stayed hidden, watching as Sarah encouraged Emily with whispers. Every time Emily took a step, Sarah praised her like she'd just climbed a mountain. This wasn't in any of the medical programs he'd paid for. It wasn't some cutting-edge device from a foreign clinic. It was love. Pure, patient love, wrapped in creativity and persistence. When the song ended, Sarah lowered Emily back to the mat and hugged her tightly. Emily's voice was full of pride when she said, "Daddy's never going to believe this." Richard stepped into the room then, his voice trembling. "I believe it, sweetheart." Emily's eyes went wide, and Sarah looked startled, almost embarrassed, as if she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't. But Richard just knelt beside them, his own eyes wet. "How?" he asked Sarah, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah explained that she'd once cared for a boy with a similar condition. Doctors had said he'd never walk either, but she refused to give up. She'd spent hours every day finding ways to engage his muscles without overwhelming him, turning exercises into games, using music to encourage movement. With Emily, she'd been doing the same, quietly and consistently, never promising results but always believing in the possibility. "No one's ever tried like this," Richard said, shaking his head. Sarah smiled gently. "Sometimes it's not about what's in the medical books. Sometimes it's about what's in here," she said, touching her heart. Over the next weeks, Richard became part of their secret routine. Every evening, if he wasn't working late, he'd sit quietly in the corner while Sarah and Emily practiced. Slowly, Emily's steps became surer. Her legs grew stronger. And then, one golden afternoon in the garden, something happened that would be etched into Richard's memory forever. They were all outside, the flowers swaying in a light breeze. Sarah helped Emily out of her chair and steadied her with the bands. But instead of swaying in place, Emily looked up at her father and said, "Daddy, watch me." And then she took 3 unassisted steps toward him. It wasn't perfect. Her legs trembled, and she wobbled like a fawn. But she was walking, truly walking, for the first time in her life. Richard caught her in his arms, lifting her into the air as tears streamed down his face. "I'm walking, Daddy," she laughed through happy sobs. From that day on, Emily's progress accelerated. She still needed support, but she was no longer bound entirely to the wheelchair. And Richard? He found himself rethinking everything he'd ever believed about success. All the wealth in the world hadn't given his daughter what she'd longed for, but a woman with no fancy degrees, no medical title, and no agenda other than love had given her hope, strength, and freedom. Richard made a quiet promise to himself: Sarah would never have to worry about her future. He offered her a permanent place in their lives, not just as a nanny, but as part of the family. And every time Emily took a step, whether it was 2 or 20, Richard remembered the night he first saw them dancing. The night love outshone everything money could buy. Because sometimes, the unbelievable isn't a sudden miracle or a dramatic twist. Sometimes, it's 1,000 small moments of faith, patience, and care, building quietly until one day, the impossible becomes possible. And that is what changes lives forever. Please subscribe my YouTube channel. Thank you.